This episode of the Crimson Post is brought to you by my Patreon supporters, including Sherry Harper, who is currently supporting at the $10 level. If you would like to make more videos like this possible, please consider joining. The link is in the description.
Salutations, and welcome to the Crimson Post, where we talk about movies, science, video games, and more. I am your host, the Crimson Gentleman, and today we're talking about A Beautiful Day in the Neighborhood, a movie about Fred Rogers of Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. But first, we have some business to conclude from the last episode, specifically the Crimson Conundrum. Now, if you didn't hear last week's episode, you should go and watch it before I reveal any spoilers. Maybe go back to get a bit of a refresher, so you remember what the riddle was. But here we go. The answer to the riddle is 7 seconds. Think about it. Alright, so now on to the movie itself. A Beautiful Day in the Neighborhood was released on November 22nd of 2019. In its opening weekend, which is all that it's made so far, is $13 million. It also hasn't made any extra money worldwide because I suppose it hasn't been released in any other countries, and I don't know if it plans to be, since it's about someone that I'm not sure if many people know about him outside of America. Perhaps it will get released in England. The critical score for it is 96%, and the audience score is 92%. Which shows that this is at least aggregately one of the best movies of the year. Though unfortunately it didn't make nearly as much money as some of the other movies that came out this year. Perhaps it is also simply biased toward people who would enjoy the movie are the only ones who are going to bother going and seeing it, though perhaps that has bumped the score a little bit. So, now, to discuss the film, I have someone with me here in the studio. Salutations, and thank you for coming. Hello, thank you for having me on the show. So people know a little bit about where you're coming from with your analysis. What is your experience with Mr. Rogers and Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood? I grew up watching Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood since I was very young, and I enjoyed watching it. I watched it less over time, of course, but I always had fond memories of the show. A few years ago, however, I learned more about Fred Rogers as a person, specifically when he testified before the United States Subcommittee on Communications in 1996, advocating for the importance of national public television and that children learn how to deal with their emotions in constructive ways. I also learned about how he cared about people as individuals, so much so that it made him difficult to be interviewed because he was always more interested in learning about the interviewer than talking about himself, and would even remember their birthdays and call them to wish them well. Yes, he was an excellent example of a human being. What was your mindset going into the movie? Going in, I honestly felt angry. Angry that they had gotten someone to play Fred Rogers, a very real and wonderful person. I felt angry that they were using his name and the legacy he built simply for profit. I think many of us can empathize with that kind of reaction. I mean, many people have that sort of reaction about characters from books not being portrayed properly, and I think it is even more so for an actual person that you respect. Has your mind changed about the movie since seeing it? Yes, it did. The movie, for me, had a feeling of loss hanging over it. Every time I saw Tom Hanks on screen, it forced me to see that it wasn't Fred Rogers. But I think they did a good job. I think they did him justice, even showing how, like I spoke about earlier, he would try to get to know the interviewers on a personal level. Sometimes, though, it seemed like Mr. Rogers was avoiding questions intentionally, and to me, that felt unlike him, but maybe he did that on occasion. Yes, I too felt the loss of Mr. Rogers throughout the film, and I can see where you're coming from, feeling like the evasiveness of the questions was uncharacteristic. I feel like it definitely played that way, even if he did behave that way in real life. It didn't come across as similar to the person who was speaking before. Was this a true story? Yes and no. Lloyd Vogel, the journalist the movie is centered on, is based on Tom Junod and his encounter with Fred Rogers. But of course they change things here and there, as they do with any movie based on a true story. Yes, I see. They do always take some liberties to make it possible to be a movie. It can be difficult to do that sometimes with true stories. What did you think of Tom Hanks as Fred Rogers? He did much better than I expected, and portrayed the spirit of Fred Rogers as well as anybody could possibly hope to do. Interesting. I definitely think there are some parts he did better than others. What did you think about Lloyd Vogel, the journalist that the movie is about? He was an interesting character, and a good example of the experience journalists would have trying to write about Mr. Rogers and interview him. Yes, I definitely think he was more of an aggregate of journalists in general, not just based off of this one journalist. What was your favorite part about the movie? My favorite part of the movie is when Lloyd asks Mrs. Joanne Rogers how it feels to be married to a living saint, and she responds by saying, "You know, I'm not fond of that term. If you think of him as a saint, then his way of being seems unattainable. He works at it all the time. It takes practice." And I think that is, in large part, what the message of the movie is about. How we almost deify these figures who we believe to be fantastic examples of people, to the point that we fail to learn the lessons that they were trying to teach us, because we then feel like it just came naturally to them, and we don't have a hope of being that way. It almost gives us an excuse to behave worse than we should. Yes, that was a very touching part, and I think it had a good message. What was your least favorite thing about the movie? My least favorite thing about the movie was how Andrea, Lloyd's wife, would pressure Lloyd throughout the movie to forgive his father before he was ready. But more than that, would force him to interact with his father against his wishes, and a few times without him even knowing that it's about to happen. For example, when he shows up home and his father's just there unexpectedly. You have an interesting point. Why did you feel that way about his wife's actions? It made me feel that way because while I do believe it is good for us to forgive people instead of holding grudges, trying to force that on someone who isn't ready could simply make the situation worse. You should forgive anyone you can. It isn't good to hold on to negative emotions like that. But having someone else try to guilt you into it isn't helpful. And that isn't forgiveness. It just leaves a feeling that you haven't had any real closure. Like you're being forced to behave a certain way that you don't really feel. And so, once you're an adult at least, it isn't anyone else's business who you forgive or when. You make some interesting points. It's definitely something to think more about. How did the movie make you feel by the end of it? The movie made me glad that people who maybe didn't know very much about Fred Rogers outside of his show would be learning more about him, and that his core message might spread just a little bit farther. I think that he would be happy that this film was made. Well, thank you so much for being here. I enjoyed talking about the movie with you. But now we have come to nearly the end of our show, where it is time for the Crimson Conundrum of this week. So, here's a thinker for you. Where on earth does the wind always blow from the south? Yeah. Give that a think, and I'll see you all in the next episode. So long!
Thank you all so much for watching this video. If you enjoyed, please let me know by leaving a like or a comment down below. This video was made possible by my Patreon supporters. If you would like to help make more videos like this possible, please consider joining. The link is in the description. Also, check out my social media profiles, including Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. The links to those are also in the description. I'll see you in the next video. Farewell.